Hello, everyone. My name is Leah Dodds. I am a manager at Foster Kinship, and today I'm here to talk with you guys about our Kinship Care Road Map and our professional guide to that roadmap that can really help you all be um, a source of support for caregivers in terms of discussing at initial placement or soon after placement the different resources that are available for families to really preserve that placement while we're working towards whatever permanency goal that child or children may have. So, the Kinship Care Road Map is a tool that we created for kinship caregivers to really provide them with a clear and straightforward overview of the decisions that they have some control over. And it can provide them with the necessary financial and legal differences so they can make the best choice for their family. It also outlines their rights and responsibilities, as well as court timelines and different permanency options that can occur, such as reunification, guardianship, and adoption. For kinship caregivers, the financial aspect of caring for children can be a big stressor on them and a big concern. And honestly, a lot of caregivers may be afraid to talk with their caseworker or their children's caseworker about it for fear that, if they're even, slightly wary of, being able to do this, that the children will be removed when in fact, for many families, really, regardless if they make $1,000 a month or $10,000 a month, the cost of raising children is burdensome for all socioeconomic statuses. And so it's really important to discuss the different financial options without judgment, really just to be a support and to think about the long term placement that this might be. And lack of financial resources for families, including childcare, is stated to be a contributing source of relative disruptions, especially if the children's needs outweighs the relative's personal resources, time, money. And so, this roadmap can provide a full disclosure of what caregivers can expect before jumping in or right when they do jump into this big process that is navigating the child welfare system, which can be really difficult. And if we can do this ahead of time and caregivers can apply right away with the support of you discussing it right away, foster kinship can help them apply. We're really going to limit relative disruption. And caregivers who work with foster kinship are found to have about 3 times less likely to disrupt than caregivers who don't. So, if you take anything away from this, it's really refer, refer, refer. Send us your caregivers because we are able to support them. And especially if you're able to talk about some of these financial resources that they may qualify for, we can make sure that they qualify and help them through the process of applying. We'll also talk a little bit about the licensing process today, too, which we almost always advocate for caregivers to get licensed because, research shows that children are safer in licensed non kinship homes than unlicensed kinship homes. But children are safest in licensed kinship home, even more so than licensed non-kinship homes, so traditional foster parents. So placing children with relatives or fictive kin caregivers who are willing to be licensed is usually the best option for children, the kinship family, and the department as well. So, what are some financial supports for kinship families? Well, there is child only TANF for blood relatives and fictive kin TANF as of July 2020. And the second option is becoming a licensed kinship foster home, which usually takes some time. So we typically recommend that if families qualify to apply for TANF while they're going through, the licensing process to really hold them over, and then it'll be turned off once they're licensed, and they'll get the higher monetary stipend. So, child only TANF or fictive kin TANF, the maximum amount is $418 a month for one child. And for each additional child, it increases by $60. The foster care reimbursement is approximately $680 a month to $777 a month. And this depends on the children's ages as well as how many days they're in the month, too, because it is a daily rate that they are reimbursed at. So the first option for child only TANF, so this is offered through the Division of Welfare and Supportive Services. Some of the requirements for child only TANF, and please note this is different than fictive kin TANF. So for child only TANF, the caregiver must be related to all of the children by blood, and they must be within a certain degree. So if they are farther than second cousins from the children, then they're not going to qualify for this. They may be able to request a hardship through welfare if they are like third or fourth cousins to the children, but that would be up to welfare to approve that. The caregiver's income and any adult or person in the home with income, it cannot exceed 275% of the poverty guidelines for their household size. And I will provide you guys with a chart of that amount as well. They need to have less than $10,000 in assets that you can touch. So, like a checking or a savings account. And they will also have to comply with child support. So, part of the requirements for welfare programs for children who do not live with their parents, and this is a federal guideline, is that the parents will have to be responsible for that most of the time. Through child support requirements. So, all the caregiver has to do is answer questions about the parent to the best of their knowledge, which they might not know, much information. So, how they apply for this is they can currently print and mail the application. Right now, interviews are over the phone due to COVID. Eventually, they will be going back in for the interview, I'm sure, at some point. They can also apply online, and there will still be an interview. Either way, we highly, highly recommend that caregivers work with us to ensure that they are eligible for child only TANF. And then we can also help them through the process. And a benefit for them doing this is one, we'll handle all, the application paperwork for them. We can also help them submit it. But also, if there is an incorrect denial, which happens often because child only TANF is probably a less known program, then we can support them with getting that denial overturned without them getting looped through, the welfare phone system, and we're just able to support them. The second option of TANF is fictive kin TANF. This is still offered through welfare. And some of the requirements are that the must be fictive kin, and it needs to say this on the placement letter. They need to be willing and able to become a licensed kinship foster home. This TANF is time limited to 6 months. So it will end after 6 months. And the whole point is that it's designed for them to, be able to tap into these resources while becoming licensed, which can take a couple of months. So it's really important that they stay on top of licensing because these funds will end. Same as child only TANF, their income cannot exceed 275% of poverty. They need to have less than 10,000 in assets that they can touch, like a checking or savings account. And they will also have to comply with child support by answering questions about the parents. So, how they apply for fictive kin TANF is they must apply through foster kinship. They cannot apply themselves with welfare, it will be denied. Essentially, what happens is we help them with the application, we send it to one of the foster parent champions, and then they send it over to welfare, a specific contact at welfare. So here's the TANF needs standards. So as you can see, the column that is yellow It's based on household size, and the size includes the children. So let's say it's grandma, grandpa, and their two grandchildren. So there's four people in the home. They need to be under gross income $6,004 per month to qualify for child only TANF. This is also the same as fictive kin. So let's say it was a two partner home. They have two kids of their own and they're caring for two children who are their godchildren. So it's a total of six children in the home. They need to be below $8,058 gross income to be able to qualify. So, this is slightly more generous than the SNAP guidelines, which are the first column, the 130% of poverty. But there is still, a cap that it's important to let the family know that. Foster Kinship offers TANF sessions. They can also give us a call, which is the preferred method, especially due to COVID. Our offices are not necessarily open to the public right now. Of course, this will change in the future, so make sure that the caregiver checks in with us. And you can also refer caregivers over to us if they're okay with us getting in contact with them. So the TANF allowances, again, for one household size, or I'm sorry, one child. So it's one child, and it is $418 a month. For two children, it's going to be $478, and so forth, increasing by $60 for each additional child. So there is a third cash program through welfare. This is less known to child welfare workers because it's not really applicable to children or caregivers, involved with the child welfare system. This is called the Kinship Care Program, and the reason it's not known is because caregivers need to have guardianship, and obviously, if they have guardianship, this is not a family that the child welfare agency would be working with typically. Children need to be in the home for 6 months. The caregiver needs to be 62 or older. So then that reduces again the population that becomes eligible for this. Caregiver still needs to be below 275% of the federal poverty line and also have less than 10,000 in assets like a checking or savings account. The amounts for this actually differ. Believe it's $413 a month if the child is under 13. I think it's right around 460 if a child is 13 or over, and that is per child. So the amounts are actually much higher than the traditional TANF program, but honestly, this kinship care program is probably not one that you would need to keep in your head, just because it doesn't really apply to the populations that you're working with. So now the second financial option, right? We just talked about the different TANF programs, which the only two that your families would really be eligible for are probably going to be the child only TANF and fictive kin TANF. Now, the second option, separate from the TANF programs, is getting licensed. I almost always recommend for caregivers to be licensed because it reaps the most benefits. However, not every family may be able to get licensed due to the requirements to becoming a foster parent, which are different than having placement of a child. So, how caregivers go through this process is they need to connect with their kinship licensing technician at the Department of Family Services. So, what happens is after initial placement, whenever that official placement is, about a week or two after, they will be assigned to a kinship licensing technician. About a week or so after, that's when the family is contacted and sent their application. They are rescheduled for their fingerprints for licensing. Then there's the kinship training, which is 5 weeks of training that they take with us at Foster Kinship, either online right now due to COVID, or they can still come in person. There's a home study and the final approval. There's a couple other little trainings that they have to do in there and requirements, but that's something that we speak in depth with them about while they're going through this process. So, some of the myths that we hear kind of perpetuated by kinship families, and what sometimes really deters them from getting licensed. If I don't get licensed, the child won't be in foster care. It's really important to let them know they're going to be in care regardless. Licensing isn't that determining factor. I don't need to get licensed. This is temporary. Of course, foster care is always supposed to be temporary, but temporary means different for different cases. I see cases where kids go home 3 months after coming into care, or they're in care years after. It just really depends. And so it's important to really put realistic, expectations of what temporary means for them. I always tell family it's better to start in the beginning. And if kids go home at 6 months, awesome, right? At least you got this process started and maybe you were licensed for a month. It's better than getting started after you've had the kids for 6 months and you might be really tapped out on resources. I don't want agency workers in my home. Well, you can let them know that a caseworker is going to be coming and checking every 30 days, anyways. So, having a licensing worker in the home is actually, well, yes, it is one additional person, but it is not every 30 days like the permanency worker is going to be checking on the kids. It's my relative. I don't need to get paid. This is something that we hear far too often because if that child was in a traditional foster parent's home, they would be getting paid instantly. And so it's really important to discuss the importance of equitable resources for kinship families, because they also deserve the same resources that traditional foster parents would get as well. And just because they don't need to get paid, it can be very helpful in caring for their relatives' children that they're caring for. So, some resources for licensed caregivers. If they do get licensed, they'll get the foster care financial reimbursement, which is right around $600 to $700 per month. And they'll also get Urban League for working caregivers past 12 months. So it's so important to let a family know if they decide not to get licensed, that if they are utilizing the child care subsidy, that is going to shut off at 12 months. And so that alone might be incentive for them to go through the licensing process. If caregivers choose not to get licensed, the only resources that they may be able to tap into are going to be the child only TANF, which again needs to be below 275% of the federal poverty line. And they also need to have a blood relationship, because remember, the fictive kin TANF, that is only for caregivers who are willing to go through the licensing process. And let's say they were, but then they decided they didn't want to, it's still going to shut off at 6 months, regardless for fictive kin. Families may also be able to tap into SNAP, depending on their income, which is slightly lower than the child only TANF. Some other important things to talk about with families, that we bring up in our information session, which is essentially a lot of the same information. We just go equally as in depth with kinship caregivers and how we can support them with applying for these resources, and conversation starters that they can have with caseworkers is talking about keeping a safe home, right? There are going to be monthly visits. Some can be unannounced. Discussing the requirements for court orders and visitation, the expectations of contact with birth parents. We often discuss how important contact with birth parents are in, especially in correlation with reunification, and having higher rates of reunification. And so that's something that, we usually get a lot of questions about from caregivers, is discussing, you know, what does visitation have to look like? What are some of those boundaries that I need to put in place? And I think sometimes a lot of caregivers are afraid to ask what those boundaries are and what they can or cannot do. So this is a good conversation to have with them. Now the end of the road, what this looks like for caregivers. And we often get questions about what this could look like. As we all know, reunification is a really important goal. And if we can get kids back home with their parents, that is the most important and best option for most children. We know that this doesn't always happen. So the other options may be guardianship or adoption. And with guardianship, it's so important that caregivers know what they are getting into with that. Informed consent is incredibly important because the resources, while guardianship might be a wonderful option and the option for a child, resources can be really different. And so, planning that ahead of time and setting those expectations can really reduce stress and future disruptions. When a caregiver becomes a guardian, they are becoming legally and financially responsible for that child until they turn 18. It suspends the rights of birth parents, and most caregivers who are caring for children will 50% of them will at least will remain with that caregiver. So if we think about that in terms of guardianships, caregivers should really be in it for the long haul, right? Especially if a case close with guardianship, the parents won't have the resources that they did have with the Department of Family Services or a child welfare agency. So it's just important to kind of outline what that looks like for them. Again, their rights and responsibilities. Foster kinship are kind of experts in wrapping around caregivers with those services. And we'd be happy to have those conversations with caregivers. And adoption, which is, that last option typically, right? When we've exhausted, reunification, when guardianship isn't going to be that good option, and the caregiver will become the legal parent and become, um, you know, that parent and have all responsibilities of, parental decision making. They will be financially and legally responsible for that child because that will be their legal child now. And with whichever option, guardianship or adoption, it's immensely important to discuss what financial resources there may and may not be available. We'll be making a separate video to talk more. I think we have one linked on our website about guardianship, but we'll make a separate one that really talks about kind of those end of the road permanency options and what resources may or may not be available for them. There's also a table on Appendix, I believe, 5 or 4 in your guide that you can tap into as well. So, in conclusion, this guide is really designed to support your conversations with kinship families, most importantly at initial placement, but really it could be throughout the entire case as well. And so we hope that this is helpful in when you're trying to talk with caregivers about what they may or may not be eligible for. And you guys can always contact Foster Kinship for additional support. Having those conversations with families so that you feel good about the information that you're providing to them. We appreciate you guys watching this. And if you guys ever wanted to watch our information session that we do with kinship families, just to kind of get an idea of what information we're providing, you can watch that on our website, fosterkinship.org/DFS. And we look forward to working with you guys. Thanks so much.